Hello, welcome to the 26th module on Australian literature. This first lecture is on beginnings of Australian literature. The Commonwealth of Australia, that is the name of the nation. As you might know, it is also a continent. This continent that is on the far south of the world and called Australia because it is so southern, was discovered by Captain James Cook on 23rd April 1770. When James Cook went there, he thought there is no human inhabitation on the island. Well, there were human beings, the Aborigines or the natives. The whites came and settled in Africa, and the earliest whites who settled in Africa were convicts or criminals or prisoners from the UK because the prisons of the UK were too full. Australia eventually became a country that is normally made of settlers from all over the world. The coming of the convicts ended within a century. By the 18th century it was over. By the 19th, that is. And Australia continued to be under British rule until the middle of the 20th century. Today, Australia is one of the most powerful countries of the world, and its capital is Canberra. It has two big cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Australia has a dry landscape, and until recently, much of the interior of Australia was uninhabited. Exploration of the continent was a very big enterprise and also a theme in literature. So are shipwrecks. When you talk about Australian literature, you have to begin from the Aboriginal period, that is before the white settlements. The natives or the Aborigines had their own oral stories, poetry, which were for both educational purposes as well as for entertainment. These stories and songs also had to do with spirituality and their religion, like it is in all native cultures. These stories and songs were about creation, about the feats of their ancestors, achievements of their ancestors, about their religion or totemism. And these oral stories were for the first time written down by the white explorers. The white explorers or the settlers first landed on Australian soil in 1788, to be precise, on 26th January. That first settlement is called the First Fleet. From this period onwards, there is Australian literature. The early Australian writers were of a pastoral tone. They were writing about nature, landscape, and what we call the bush. The bush is the largely unsettled land outside of the cities. And in these bushes or lightly wooded areas, there were convicts on the loose, with policemen chasing them. This gave rise to what is called bush literature. The writings of bush life or pastoral literature is the main genre within colonial Australian literature. The hazardous life of the bushmen or the drovers or the swagmen were written at this time by the early writers. Some of them were convicts themselves, such as Watkin Tench, Charles Harper, Marcus Clerk. Marcus Clerk is very important. He has written the famous book, His Natural Life. Then another early writer was William Wentworth, James Tucker, etc. These early writers wrote in magazines. There were publications at this time. Publishing companies slowly came into being. Newspapers began. And they wrote about convict and colonial life. During the second half of the 19th century, gold was discovered in Australia, like it was in Canada also, in the Yukon County. And this gave rise to large-scale immigration into Australia. This is called the Gold Rush. The Gold Rush gave rise to literature of its own. Many writers wrote short stories, especially, about the Gold Rush. One important figure was Henry Handel Richardson. Hey, this was not a man. It was actually Ethel Richardson, a woman, who wrote under the male pseudonym Henry Handel Richardson. And her most important work was a trilogy, The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney. Come to the end of the 19th century, we have the first centenary of the First Fleet. In 1888, they celebrated 100 years of settlement. This gave rise to a period of nationalism. Australia for Australians, that was their slogan at this time. There was a spirit of nationalism. National sentiments were expressed in literature at this time. I can hear some fireworks. I don't know, something is being celebrated somewhere. Anyway, let us continue. I was talking about the period of nationalism. Australian consciousness was expressed in Australian literature at this time. Very important at this time is the weekly magazine, the Bulletin. It started in 1880 in Sydney. Bulletin gave rise to a bulletin group of writers. They wrote in a very concise, succinct style. The Bulletin writers were the early major group of writers in Australia. They included J.F. Archibald, the editor of the Bulletin, A.G. Stephens, the editor of the literary red page of the Bulletin, A.B. Patterson or Banjo Patterson, Banjo was the pen name, who was a major poet, Henry Lawson, the short story writer, then Mary Gilman, John Shaw Neilson, and others. A.B. Patterson wrote about the Australian landscape and countryside in a romantic way. And his very major contribution to Australian literature is his collections of bush ballads and the poem Waltzing Matilda. Waltzing Matilda is almost of the stature of an unofficial national anthem in Australia. Waltzing Matilda tells a story of a swagman or drover or bushman, a convict. He is living a very harsh life in the bush. He doesn't have anything to eat. He's pursued by a policeman. And he steals a jumbuck or sheep that belongs to somebody else. And he cooks it and eats it. The policemen with the owner of the sheep come after him. To save himself from being captured and tortured, he jumps into a nearby watering hole and commits suicide. This is an expression of the resilience, of the bravery, of the hardships, of the adaptability of bush life, which is the most important theme in A.B. Patterson's poetry. Waltzing Matilda. Waltzing is a slang for traveling on foot. Matilda refers to the bedroll that these swagmen carried on their back. It doesn't mean a dancing woman like you might think. The next important writer is Henry Lawson. He was a short story writer, and he did not have a romantic view of the Australian landscape like A.B. Patterson or Banjo Patterson had. The Drover's Wife, The Loaded Dog, these are light-hearted stories of the gold rush, for which Henry Lawson is remembered. There was another major poet at this time, an early poet, Christopher Brennan. There is a Christopher Brennan Prize for poetry named after him. The father of Australian novel is considered to be Joseph Furphy. Joseph Furphy is remembered for the major work, Such is Life. Then there was Barbara Baynton. I know she is prescribed in some universities. She is part of the syllabus. So, Barbara Baynton is important. She has written short stories called Bush Studies. And then there is the very major writer Miles Franklin. The highest ranking literary award of Australia is named after her, Miles Franklin. She has written a number of major novels, especially My Brilliant Career. This novel was written when she was a mere teenager, and she wrote it to amuse her friends. It's about a girl growing up in rural Australia. Then there is another brilliant writer, Catherine Susannah Pritchard. She has written books like Working Bullocks and Cunardu. These are also rustic novels and descriptions of the landscape. So that is about the pastoral or colonial period of Australian literature. Next, in the 20th century, the modernist period begins. I wish you would look up more about these writers. Read them. Many of their works, especially the poems, are available online. Please go read them, enjoy them, know more about them, and do our tests. Thank you very much.